The clay feels cold in the scholar's hands, not the polished, harmless cold of something resting behind museum glass, but the deep, stubborn chill of a basement vault. A cold that slips through fabric gloves and settles into the joints. London. British Museum storage. Early 20th century. A catalog number written in careful records, BM 78941. Just 8 inches of baked earth marked with rows of wedge-shaped signs pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago. The tablet is damaged. Its upper corner is gone. Small fractures run across the surface like old fault lines, traces of pressure, time transport, and neglect. It is not beautiful in the way people expect ancient objects to be. It looks worn, broken, practical. But enough survives. Enough for a trained eye to follow the lines. Enough for a scholar to realize that what this tablet says is not what later traditions taught the world to expect. Because this text does not begin with forbidden fruit. It does not begin with a serpent, or a tree, or a theft of sacred fire, or a tower reaching toward heaven. Instead, it preserves something simpler and somehow more unsettling. According to this tablet and its related fragments, humanity's first great problem was not moral corruption. It was not rebellion in the way later myths like to imagine it. It was not that we defied the gods by becoming too wicked. It was that we became too many. We multiplied. We filled the land. We built settlements into cities. We made the ordinary noise of living, the noise of work and birth and trade and animals and arguments and tools and song. And in doing so, we disturbed the rest of the gods. That according to one of the oldest literary traditions in human history was the crisis. If you are listening to this at night, there is something fitting about that. These ancient lines feel different in darkness. They belong to quiet hours, to the uneasy awareness of how loud human life can be once you begin paying attention to it. The creak of a house, the hum of a city beyond the window, the distant engine, the barking dog, the television through the wall. Noise becomes visible in the mind when the night is deep enough. The text in the scholar's hands belongs to what we call the Atrahasis epic. The name means exceedingly wise, referring to the human figure at the center of the story. But wisdom, as this tradition makes painfully clear, is not enough to protect humanity from the consequences of being exactly what it was designed to be. Because that is where the story begins, not with sin, not with destiny, not with divine love, with labor. The oldest Mesopotamian creation traditions do not describe humanity as a cherished reflection of the divine. They describe humanity as a practical solution, a workforce, a substitute class brought into existence because the gods themselves were tired of doing difficult work. The opening of Atrahasis is startlingly direct. Before there were humans, the gods labored. They dug river channels. They maintained irrigation lines. They hauled burdens. They performed the exhausting tasks required to sustain the ordered world. And eventually the younger gods, the ones assigned to this labor, reached a breaking point. The text says their loads were too heavy, their work was too hard, their distress was too great, so they revolted. Not symbolically, not poetically. They burned their tools. They marched by night to the dwelling of Enlil, the high god, the divine ruler, associated with authority, kingship, and command. They surrounded his house. They made their complaint openly. In some versions, their message is blunt enough to feel almost modern. The labor is killing us. What follows is one of the most fascinating moments in ancient literature, because Enlil does not simply crush the uprising. He calls a council. The gods assemble. They debate. They discuss the crisis like administrators facing a structural problem in a strained system. And in that council, a proposal emerges, one that will change the order of the world, create a new being. not another god, not an equal, something lower but useful, something intelligent enough to perform work but not high enough to resist its assigned role. A creature that can bear the burden the gods no longer wish to carry. In some versions, this being is called Lulu primitive man, a worker species. But the making of such a creature requires more than clay alone. One god must be sacrificed to provide the pattern, the intelligence, the spark that will animate the new creation. The traditions vary in details, but the figure most often named is a god called Wi'ila, sometimes associated with intelligence or understanding. He is killed, and his flesh and blood are mixed with clay by the mother goddess, known by names such as Nintu or Ninhursag. The text describes the process with a surprising lack of mystery. It is procedural, almost technical. Clay is prepared. Divine material is added. Birth goddesses are summoned. Forms are shaped. In some recensions, 7 males and 7 females are made. The language feels less like a hymn and more like an account of manufacture. That matters, because this is not creation as blessing, it is creation as labor policy. Humanity is not introduced as the beloved center of the cosmos. Humanity is introduced as a practical answer to a labor dispute. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish preserves the same basic logic in a different frame. There, after the god Marduk establishes cosmic order through victory over chaos, he proposes the creation of mankind so that the gods may be at ease. That phrase matters. At ease, rested, relieved. Human beings are created, so divine beings can step back from toil. Even other related Mesopotamian texts reinforce the same pattern. In the composition known as Enki and Ninmah, the creation of humans appears again as an act of shaping functional beings, and even flawed beings are assigned roles. Every form must be put to use. Every body must serve some place in the system. The thinking is unmistakably practical. Humans are useful. That is the point. And for a while, the arrangement works. The gods hand over labor. Humanity takes on the burdens of cultivation, construction, maintenance, food production, and all the work of settled life. The divine world is relieved. Order is maintained. The creators seem satisfied with their solution, at first, because the same intelligence that makes humans useful also makes them capable of growth. We do not remain static. We organize, we reproduce, we gather, we expand. Villages become cities, paths become roads, storehouses appear, markets form, fields widen, herds increase, kilns burn, tools strike, children are born, festivals happen, music rises, arguments break out, doors open and shut. Life scales upward, and with scale comes sound. This is where the text shifts from creation to disturbance. Atrahasis says that after a span of years, the land expanded, the people multiplied, and the earth was noisy like a bull. That image is vivid and strange. Not evil like a serpent, not corrupt like rot, loud like an animal bellowing in enclosed space. The Akkadian terms used in these passages carry meanings like uproar, noise, clamor, tumult, not necessarily rebellion, not necessarily disobedience, just the overwhelming sound of human civilization becoming too dense, too active, too present. And Enlil hears it. The king of the gods, the divine authority who governs order, cannot sleep because of human noise. That is the complaint, not that humans stopped working, not that they failed in their function, not that they turned against their makers. They succeeded. They multiplied, work had built and filled the world with the living sound of success. And in doing so, they became intolerable. That is the hinge the whole tradition turns on. Humanity was created to solve a problem, but the solution generated a second problem the gods had not accounted for. A productive species became a noisy species. A labor force became a civilization. And civilization, by its nature, is loud. So, Enlil does what rulers do in Mesopotamian literature when order becomes strained. He calls another council, and this time the question is no longer how to make humanity. It is how to reduce it. To understand why that noise mattered so much, you have to step back from the image of angry gods and look at how Mesopotamian civilization imagined order itself. Because in these texts, sound is not just sound, it is a sign, a condition, a clue that something in the balance of the world has tipped too far. The people who wrote these tablets lived in one of the most fragile landscapes on Earth. Southern Mesopotamia was fertile, but only if everything worked. Rivers had to be managed. Canals had to be cleared. Water had to arrive at the right time and in the right quantity. Too little meant famine. Too much meant destruction. The line between abundance and catastrophe was thin enough that entire cities could feel like temporary victories against chaos. That shaped their theology. The Mesopotamian universe was not imagined as naturally stable. It required maintenance, constant maintenance. The gods themselves were associated with the ordering of forces that could easily slip back into disorder: sky and earth, flood and drought, kingship and rebellion, field and marsh, city and wilderness. Even the existence of civilization felt conditional. Hard won, easily lost. So, when the Atrahasis epic describes humanity becoming loud, the problem is not just annoyance. It is stress within a delicately maintained system. The words used in these texts help us see that. The Akkadian term, often translated as noise or uproar, can also imply disturbance, clamor, troubling commotion. It is not the joyful noise of a single festival. It is the overwhelming accumulation of human presence. The sound of too many people living too closely, too busily, too continuously. The text says the land was bellowing like a bull. That image suggests pressure force agitation, something powerful and difficult to ignore. And Enlil, the god, associated with command and cosmic authority, reacts in a telling way. He says he cannot sleep. That line is often read too quickly, as if it were just an odd, mythic detail. But sleep in Mesopotamian thought is not merely rest in the casual sense. Divine rest implies order preserved. A king who cannot sleep is not just uncomfortable. A king who cannot sleep is facing a failure in the proper arrangement of the world around him. Disturbance has crossed a threshold. Temple architecture hints at this way of thinking. The gods were imagined to dwell in sacred spaces elevated above the city within carefully maintained precincts where ritual order was meant to hold. Temples were houses, yes, but also centers of managed cosmic relation. Food was brought, hymns were sung, rites were performed. Everything had structure. Timing mattered. Conduct mattered. Sacred sound had its place. Sacred silence had its place too. But the ambient roar of dense human life is something else entirely. It is unsanctioned noise, not ritualized, not contained, not directed upward as worship, but spreading outward in every direction as the byproduct of ordinary existence. Markets, tools, animals, disputes, childbirth, movement, construction, music, traffic, celebration. The texts give the impression that humanity has become acoustically unavoidable. Civilization has matured into constant background pressure. And this creates a theological problem, because humans were created to labor, but labor leads to settlement. Settlement leads to growth. Growth leads to cities. Cities lead to noise. In other words, the very design that made humanity useful also made humanity disruptive. That is what makes the Mesopotamian version of human origins so unsettling. There is no clear moral failing at the start. The failure is structural. The problem is built into the success of the project itself. Enlil's answer in the Atrahasis epic is not philosophical reflection. It is management. The divine council meets and a decision is made. Human numbers must be reduced. The texts preserve the logic with a kind of harsh administrative clarity. The issue is not whether humanity deserves to exist. Humanity clearly still serves a purpose. The issue is that humanity exists at an intolerable scale. So the response is not immediate extinction. Not yet. The first response is reduction. This matters because it reveals how the gods are framing the situation. Humanity is not treated as a family that has disappointed its maker. Humanity is treated more like a population problem, a troublesome workforce, too numerous, too loud, too difficult to leave unchecked. The first intervention is often associated with plague or mass death, though the surviving tablets are damaged and not every detail is fully intact. What is clear is that Enlil proposes devastation through the agency of death. The goal is not total annihilation. The goal is decrease, silence through fewer bodies. And what happens next introduces one of the most important tensions in the whole tradition. Enki intervenes. Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, craft, intelligence, and often human sympathy, does not openly overturn the divine decision. He does something more complicated. He warns humanity in indirect ways. He gives instructions that allow survival. He shows humans how to endure what is being sent against them. This pattern repeats again and again. Enlil seeks reduction. Enki subverts the reduction just enough to keep humanity alive. And that tells us something crucial. The gods are not unified in their view of the human problem. For Enlil, humanity has become an operational threat to divine rest. For Enki, humanity remains a creation worth preserving, perhaps because he helped design it, perhaps because wisdom tends towards sympathy, perhaps because he recognizes that humans are doing exactly what they were made to do. The texts never fully explain his motives, but they make his pattern unmistakable. He is the god who bends rules without breaking them outright. He preserves life through technicality, counsel, and cleverness. The first reduction fails in the long run because humans survive and recover. Population grows again. The noise returns. Then comes drought. This second intervention is described with even more detail in the surviving versions of Atrahasis. The gods withhold rain. Water levels drop. Fields fail. Springs weaken. Harvests diminish year after year. The text tracks the worsening crisis with grim patience. Hunger changes faces. The land dries. People become desperate. Social order frays. It is not a sudden apocalypse. It is a slow tightening of the world. This is one reason the story feels so modern, or at least so psychologically recognizable. Disaster arrives not only as flood or thunderbolt, but as system failure. Less water, less grain, longer lines, thinner bodies, harder choices. The texts understand the cruelty of attrition, and again, Enki intervenes. He advises humanity to direct offerings toward the right god, to appeal through a narrow channel, to exploit a weakness in the system. In some versions, he instructs Atrahasis to focus worship on the storm god Adad, whose favor can restore rain. The tactic works. Relief comes. The drought ends. Humanity survives. And with survival comes regrowth, which means inevitably the noise comes back too. The third intervention is famine on a broader, more coordinated scale. Enlil learns from previous failures. A single pressure point can be bypassed, so multiple aspects of survival are targeted at once. Agricultural growth is blocked. Bread fails. The land produces little. Scarcity spreads deeper than before. In the darkest lines of the epic, the suffering becomes unbearable. Families collapse under hunger. Social bonds break under the weight of survival. The text moves into scenes that are horrifying precisely because they are narrated so directly. And yet even then, Enki finds ways for humanity to endure. Fish from his own watery domain become a source of food. Life persists where total reduction was intended. Once again, the species slips through the gap between judgment and extinction. By now, a pattern is visible, and the epic wants you to notice it. Humanity keeps recovering. Humanity keeps multiplying. Humanity keeps becoming loud again. No partial correction holds for long, and this leads the divine council toward a harder conclusion. If plague does not solve the problem, and drought does not solve the problem, and famine does not solve the problem, then the issue is not incidental. The issue is humanity itself as a species capable of regrowth. As long as humans remain what they are, they will do what life does. They will rebuild. They will reproduce. They will produce culture, density, labor, sound. So the council begins moving toward a final solution, the flood. But before the story reaches that point, another strand of Mesopotamian tradition helps deepen the anxiety behind it. Because the problem is not only that humans are many, it is that humans are getting dangerously capable. This is where the figure of Adapa becomes important. Adapa is not presented as an ordinary man. He is associated with Eridu, one of the oldest and most sacred cities in Mesopotamian memory. He is wise, exceptionally wise, because Enki has granted him deep understanding. The text says he was given wisdom, but not eternal life. That distinction is deliberate. Intelligence is allowed. Immortality is withheld. The story turns when Adapa breaks the wing of the south wind after it overturns his boat. This act draws the attention of Anu, the sky god, who summons Adapa to heaven. Before Adapa goes, Enki gives him specific instructions. He tells him what to say, how to behave, and most importantly, what not to eat or drink. Adapa obeys, and that obedience costs him everything, because once in heaven, he is offered not death, but life. Food of life, water of life. A chance, perhaps unique, to cross the line between mortal and divine. But trusting Enki's warning, Adapa refuses. He follows the instruction perfectly and loses immortality in the process. That myth matters here because it reveals another divine boundary. Humans may become wise. Humans may become useful. Humans may even become impressive. But there are limits they are not meant to cross. Mortality remains one of those limits. When you place Adapa beside Atrahasis, a larger pattern emerges. Humanity is allowed function. Humanity is allowed intelligence. Humanity is even allowed survival. But humanity is not allowed uncontrolled increase, and it is not allowed freedom from death. The gods preserve a distance between themselves and their workers. The flood will make that principle absolute. By the time the flood is proposed, the Atrahasis tradition has already done something unusual for ancient literature. It has turned catastrophe into procedure. That is what makes it so unnerving. The disasters are not framed as random acts of rage. They are not sudden emotional outbursts from unpredictable deities. They come after meetings, after complaints, after decisions. The gods discuss the matter. The problem is identified. A response is selected. It is then carried out against humanity with grim efficiency. The feeling is less like myth in the soft, dreamy sense and more like policy. And once you notice that tone, it becomes hard to unsee. And Lil has a complaint. Humanity is too loud. The first measures fail. Population falls, then rises again. The species proves resilient. It absorbs losses, rebuilds, multiplies, restores itself. Enki keeps making sure of that. So the divine assembly begins to move away from temporary correction and toward irreversible reset. This is the point where the flood enters not just as a dramatic event, but as a conclusion. The logic is brutal. If humanity cannot remain small on its own, and if partial reductions do not hold, then the species must be cut back so completely that the problem disappears, not quieted for a generation, not softened for a century, erased. The versions of the story preserved in Atrahasis and echoed later in the Epic of Gilgamesh make clear that this was understood as a decision taken in council. It is the word of the gods together, not one divine whim. That detail matters because it transforms the flood from weather into judgment backed by institution. It is cosmic government acting at full scale. But even here, the tradition preserves tension. Enki does not agree with total destruction. He does not openly defy the council because direct opposition would fracture the divine order itself. Instead, he does what he always does. He bends the structure without openly breaking it. He warns one human. That human is Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one. Though in other related traditions, the survivor appears under other names like Ziusudra in Sumerian texts or Utnapishtim in the Akkadian version embedded in Gilgamesh. The variations matter for historians, but the pattern remains the same. One man is chosen, one household preserved, one line carried across the destruction. And the way Enki gives the warning is one of the cleverest details in all of Mesopotamian myth. He does not speak directly to the man. He speaks to the wall. "O wall, listen. Read wall, pay attention." It sounds strange at first, but the logic is perfect. Enki can claim he did not directly disobey the order. He did not tell the human. He addressed the structure. He preserved technical obedience while still saving life. This is classic Enki intelligence used not to overthrow the system, but to slip through its cracks. The instructions are practical. Destroy your house. Build a boat. Abandon possessions. Save life. Bring aboard family, and in some versions, craftsmen, seeds, and animals. Construct a vessel roofed and sealed, hidden from the sun, watertight, above and below. Again, what is striking is the tone. The instructions are not mystical. They are detailed and functional. The boat is not a symbol. It is an engineering project. The flood is not vague terror. It is a coming physical event that requires preparation. Atrahasis obis. And here, the story becomes quietly devastating. He does not warn everyone. He does not begin a public campaign. He does not gather the city and cry out against what is coming. In most versions, secrecy is part of the process. He builds while others remain unaware. Neighbors help. Workers assist. People go on living ordinary life around the rising frame of the vessel that will save one family and leave the rest behind. The text does not dwell on this with emotional commentary. It barely needs to. The moral discomfort is built into the structure itself. When the flood comes, it is sudden and overwhelming. Dark clouds gather. Storms break. Waters rise from above and below. The language in the tablets makes the event feel total, like the normal architecture of the world has failed all at once. The flood is not only rain, it is the breakdown of boundaries. Rivers exceed themselves. Springs burst upward. Sky and earth seem to lose their separation. This is one reason flood myths are so powerful across civilizations. Water is not just destructive, it is unmaking. It takes shape away from things. Streets vanish, walls disappear, names and plans and borders dissolve under it. The flood in Atrahasis is not merely mass death, it is decreation. For 7 days and 7 nights, according to the common pattern, the storm rages. The boat is driven over the waters. Everything outside it is swallowed. The language of later parallel accounts describes people turning to clay, cities erased voices ended. And that last point matters more than ever here, because silence is the goal. What Enlil wanted from the beginning was rest. The flood achieves it in the most complete way possible. No more crowds, no more labor sounds, no more bellowing earth, no more sleeplessness caused by human civilization. The world after the deluge is quiet because almost no one is left alive to make sound. That is the terrible success of the flood, and yet the story immediately introduces irony. When the waters calm and the survivor emerges, he offers sacrifice. He builds an altar, he slaughters animals, he burns offerings, and the gods smelling the sacrifice gather around it. In the Akkadian version, the comparison is unforgettable. They gather like flies. For all their power, the gods have discovered something important. They do not merely rule humanity, they depend on humanity. Without people to cultivate, offer, cook, pour, and speak ritual words, divine life becomes strangely empty. The flood solved the noise problem, but it also cut off the flow of service and sacrifice that connected gods to the world. So, the flood reveals a contradiction at the heart of the whole system. The gods need humans. They just do not want too many of them. That is why total extinction cannot be allowed to stand. Enlil is furious when he discovers a survivor. He demands to know how any life escaped when destruction was meant to be complete. But Enki counters him, and in doing so, pushes the tradition into its most revealing phase. He argues that total annihilation was excessive. There were other ways to manage humanity. That phrase matters. Manage humanity. Not love, redeem, forgive, elevate, but manage. And from that argument comes the post-flood settlement, one of the bleakest and most fascinating ideas in ancient religious literature. The gods decide not to erase humanity completely, but to redesign the human condition so that pre-flood levels of population will never happen again. This is where the story shifts from catastrophe to biology. According to the surviving ending of Atrahasis, Enki proposes permanent constraints built into human life itself. Some women will be unable to bear children. Some infants will die. Certain women will be set apart in religious service and forbidden from reproduction. Death will remain active in the human population as a constant limiter. Disease and famine will continue as background forces. Humanity will survive, but only under reduced terms. This is not temporary punishment. It is species management. The flood becomes the dividing line between two kinds of humanity. Before it, humans multiplied too successfully. After it, humans live under built-in restrictions designed to prevent that success from happening again. The text's language is direct enough to feel almost administrative. A third category of women who do not bear. A demon to snatch the child from the lap. Priestesses who remain taboo outside ordinary family structure. Death constantly diminishing the people. The emotional effect of these lines is hard to escape. They reframe some of the darkest parts of human experience: infertility, infant death, early mortality, as not unfortunate accidents, but deliberate features of the world's design after divine dissatisfaction with humanity's growth. Whether one reads that as literal belief-symbolic reflection or theological explanation for suffering, the logic is still there. Human vulnerability is not random in this framework. It is purposeful. It exists because unchecked human thriving once became a problem. That is the price of survival after the flood. And the story becomes even more unsettling when you realize that this is not presented as a triumph. It is a bargain. The gods get what they want: continued service without the return of intolerable human scale. Humanity gets what it can: existence, but smaller, sadder, less secure. This also helps explain why mortality matters so much in related Mesopotamian stories. Oedipa was denied immortality. Gilgamesh will later fail to obtain it. The flood survivor may be granted exceptional treatment, but ordinary humanity is not. Death is not just a fact of life. It is part of the post-flood structure that keeps human numbers turning over. Mortality is governance. The texts do not say this in those exact words, but the pattern implies it. If humans lived forever, even reduced fertility would not solve the problem forever. Numbers would accumulate over time. Mortality ensures turnover. It keeps the species from becoming acoustically overwhelming again. So, when later Mesopotamian heroes seek eternal life, they are not merely longing for personal escape. They are pressing against a boundary the gods have good reason in this tradition to defend. The flood, then, is not just a punishment story. It is a reset followed by redesign. And once you see that, the whole emotional atmosphere of Mesopotamian myth changes. Human beings are not simply sinners needing forgiveness. They are creatures whose makers found them useful, then excessive, then necessary again, under stricter terms. The gods are not purely loving parents, nor are they merely monsters. They are rulers with interests, limits, irritations, dependencies, and internal disagreements. That complexity is what gives these texts their force. They do not flatten the divine into moral simplicity. They preserve a world where creators can be both dependent on and threatened by what they create. And that raises a question the story never fully answers. If humanity's problem was being too successful at being human, then was humanity ever truly at fault? Or was the flaw already present in the design from the beginning? That question lingers over nearly every line of the tradition, even when the tablets themselves never pause long enough to ask it directly. If humans were created to work, then work would naturally produce settlement. Settlement would produce families, storage, irrigation, trade, administration. And once those things exist, growth follows. It is almost impossible to imagine a laboring species with intelligence not eventually producing organized life at scale. In other words, the same qualities that made humanity valuable to the gods also made humanity difficult to contain. The Mesopotamian texts seem to understand this, even if they never turn it into a formal accusation against the gods themselves. They preserve the consequences of the design without quite condemning the designers. But in the silence between lines, the problem is there. You made us capable. You made us necessary. You made us fertile. And then you punished us for the world that fertility produced. That tension becomes even sharper when you place the flood story next to another group of ancient Mesopotamian texts, the wisdom traditions, the proverbs, the instructions, the advice literature that was copied by scribes for centuries. Because once the world has been reset and humanity has been reduced, the culture that emerges is shaped by one quiet lesson above all others. Do not become too much. One of the most important of these texts is known as the Instructions of Shurupak. It presents itself as advice passed from father to son, from the old world into the new. In Mesopotamian tradition, Shurupak is linked to the final generation before the flood. His son, in some versions, is the survivor himself. So, the whole work carries a kind of haunting authority. These are not just proverbs. They are framed as words spoken at the edge of catastrophe. And what is striking is how ordinary the advice sounds at first. Do not boast. Do not linger where quarrels are happening. Do not place yourself in danger. Do not speak carelessly. Respect hierarchy. Manage property carefully. Stay out of unnecessary conflict. On the surface, this looks like practical social wisdom, the kind any early urban civilization might produce. But read in the shadow of Atrahasis, and a pattern begins to appear. The advice is not only about morality, it is about reducing friction, reducing attention, reducing disturbance. Stay small, stay careful, stay quiet. The text repeatedly favors restraint over display, humility over loudness, stability over expansion. It warns against boastfulness, not simply because pride is ugly, but because boastfulness is noisy. It makes you socially prominent. It draws eyes, ears, reaction. It increases your human footprint in the world. And in a civilization haunted by the memory that divine patience once ran out because humanity became too loud, that kind of advice takes on a second layer. Even the domestic and economic instructions begin to sound different. Do not choose the wrong kind of house. Do not place yourself at the center of public traffic. Do not create unnecessary entanglements. Do not live in ways that multiply conflict. All of it feels like a cultural translation of the flood's lesson into daily life. The world after the flood is not meant to be empty, but it is meant to be restrained. That is what these wisdom texts seem to preserve a civilization teaching itself how not to trigger disaster again. This helps explain why Mesopotamian literature often feels so cautious, even when it is grand. The people of these cities built temples, canals, archives, walls, and legal systems. They were not anti-civilization. Far from it. They were one of the first civilizations. But their own stories suggest they believed civilization must stay inside limits. Growth without restraint was dangerous. Density without order was dangerous. Loudness without sacred framing was dangerous. It is a worldview built not around unlimited expansion, but around managed survival. That same anxiety surfaces in the Epic of Gilgamesh, though in a different key. Gilgamesh is a king of immense energy and ambition. He builds walls. He seeks fame. He pushes past ordinary limits. At first, he looks like the very image of human greatness, restless, powerful, impossible to contain. And yet the arc of his story is not one of triumph over the boundary between man and God. It is a long confrontation with mortality. After the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh is shattered by the realization that he too must die. So he goes searching for eternal life. And who does he seek out? The flood survivor. In the Akkadian epic, that survivor is Utnapishtim, effectively the same preserved figure who crossed the flood in earlier traditions. Gilgamesh travels beyond ordinary human space to find him and ask the question at the center of all mortal anxiety: how did you escape death? What he finds is not a path open to everyone. He finds an exception. Utnapishtim did not achieve immortality by effort, virtue, or heroic conquest. He survived because he was warned. He was preserved because the gods made an exception. And that exception was never meant to become a general rule. Gilgamesh learns that what happened once will not happen again for ordinary humanity. Even when he is briefly shown the possibility of renewal through the plant of life, it slips away. a serpent takes it. Gilgamesh returns home with wisdom instead of immortality. He goes back to Uruk and looks at its walls, human walls, mortal walls, built by human hands for human time. That ending makes much more sense when you read it beside a trahesis. Gilgamesh cannot become immortal because humanity is not meant to cross that line. Death is part of the system now. Not accidental, not negotiable, but structural. The flood survivor stands outside normal human fate precisely because he marks the point where the world changed. He is a monument, not a model. And Gilgamesh, for all his power, must finally accept what post-flood humanity is: brilliant, capable, creative, but temporary. That same logic reaches back into the Adapa story too. Adapa comes close to immortality and loses it through obedience. Gilgamesh seeks it and fails through limitation. Atrahasis survives extinction, but only enters a world redesigned around mortality and control. Different texts, same pattern. Again and again, Mesopotamian tradition insists that human beings may approach the divine in wisdom, in kingship, in ritual knowledge, even in extraordinary favor, but they may not erase the line that keeps them finite. Why? Because finitude is part of the answer to the original problem. Death keeps populations from accumulating endlessly. Vulnerability keeps life unstable enough that no human society can remain permanently swollen. Disease, famine, childbirth, risk, and ordinary mortality all do the work that before the flood required direct divine intervention. What the gods once had to impose from outside is now embedded within the structure of life itself. That is the dark genius of the post-flood settlement. The gods no longer need to keep calling councils every time humanity grows too noisy. The correction is built in. And if that sounds bleak, it is because the text does not try very hard to soften it. Later traditions, especially those shaped by very different theological instincts, tend to present suffering as either punishment for wrongdoing or a test with hidden moral meaning. Mesopotamian literature often feels more severe than that. It frequently presents suffering as part of the machinery of existence, not always deserved, not always explained, but functional. That may be why these old tablets still feel so modern in places. They do not always reassure. They often describe systems, power systems, survival systems, ecological systems, political systems. The gods in these stories do not stand outside necessity. They are entangled in it. They need labor. They need offerings. They need order. They become irritated by the consequences of their own arrangements. They act to preserve their comfort and authority. Humanity lives inside the pressures created by those decisions. And from inside that world, wisdom looks different. Wisdom is not conquering heaven. Wisdom is not becoming limitless. Wisdom is learning how to live under a ceiling, which brings us back to the old instructions in Proverbs. Their quietness is not accidental. It is civilizational memory, a long cultural echo of the idea that survival depends on not drawing too much attention, not expanding too carelessly, not mistaking success for safety. Because in these texts, success is exactly what became dangerous. Humanity's first mistake was not failure. It was flourishing without a break. Once you see that pattern, other Mesopotamian texts begin to look less like isolated myths and more like different angles on the same old fear. The fear is not simply that humans are weak. It is that humans are powerful in the wrong way, powerful enough to build cities, powerful enough to organize labor, powerful enough to multiply, spread, and reshape landscapes, powerful enough to create the very conditions that make civilization possible, but not powerful enough to control the consequences of that success without breaking something larger. That may be why so many of these stories feel as if they are haunted by thresholds, invisible lines, not moral lines in the later, cleaner sense of sin and virtue, but structural lines. How many people can gather before a city becomes dangerous? How much noise can a civilization make before the sound itself becomes a kind of disorder? How much growth can be sustained before nature? Fate or the gods answer back. The Mesopotamians did not ask those questions in modern language. They did not speak of carrying capacity or systems collapse. But they clearly understood that there were limits built into reality, and that ignoring those limits led to catastrophe. That understanding appears in the flood traditions, of course, but it also survives in fragments and older variants that complicate the picture further. One of the most important is what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian flood narrative preserved only in damaged form. It is earlier than the full Akkadian Atrahasis tradition, as we know it, but more fragmentary. Whole sections are missing. Key explanations are lost. The result is a text that feels both ancient and unsettlingly incomplete. In the surviving lines, the gods create humanity and establish kingship. Cities are founded. Civilization is set in place. Everything seems ordered. Everything seems to function. Then, after a gap in the tablet where crucial lines have broken away, the flood is already underway. That missing section matters, because unlike the fuller Atrahasis version, the surviving Eridu Genesis does not clearly tell us why the flood was sent. The justification, if it was ever written on the preserved portion, is gone. All we have is the before and the after. Civilization existed. Then the gods decided on a flood. One man was warned. One boat was built. One line was preserved. That silence has always made the text fascinating. It may simply be an accident of damage. Clay breaks. Edges wear away. Whole explanations vanish because a tablet survives in pieces. But the effect is eerie. In the oldest surviving version, humanity's destruction is barely explained at all. Catastrophe arrives with the force of divine fact rather than moral argument. The gods decide. The flood comes. Most life ends. Later traditions like Atrahasis provide a much clearer explanation. Humanity multiplied, humanity became noisy, Enlil lost sleep. But the older silence matters because it reminds us that explanation may have come after memory. First, there is catastrophe. Then there is theology built to make sense of it. That pattern is very human. When people live through devastation, the event comes first. Meaning comes later. Floodwater does not arrive with commentary. It arrives with force. The stories told afterward try to answer why. They turn trauma into pattern, into warning, into culture. That is exactly what seems to happen across Mesopotamian literature. The flood becomes not only a remembered disaster, but a framework for understanding the whole human condition after it. Why do people die young? Why do children fail to survive? Why is life so fragile? Why do cities flourish and then fall? Why is prosperity never fully secure? Because once the gods nearly erased us for becoming too much. And because after that, the world was never allowed to be the same again. The flood survivor in the Sumerian tradition is usually called Ziusudra. In later Akkadian texts, he becomes Utnapishtim. In Atrahasis, the figure is folded into the wise man whose name titles the epic. The names change, but the function stays remarkably steady. He is the one who receives warning, the one who passes through destruction, the one who stands at the seam between the old world and the diminished one that follows. And what happens to him after the flood is extremely revealing. In some versions, he is granted life like a god and taken away to a distant place, often imagined as a paradisal land at the edge of the world. That sounds like reward, and in a sense it is. But it is also removal. The flood survivor does not return to ordinary human life and begin a second, unlimited civilization. He becomes an exception, cut off from the normal human stream. This solves several problems at once. It honors the survivor. It preserves the memory of divine favor, and it prevents the exception from becoming a new beginning of uncontrolled human increase. Even the man who crossed the flood is not allowed to reset the species on pre-flood terms. That detail tells you how serious the boundary is. If immortality or exceptional survival were allowed to spread, the old problem would return sooner or later. Human numbers would accumulate. Great founders would become anchors of permanent expansion. But Mesopotamian thought resists that possibility. The one who survives becomes almost museum-like, within the tradition itself, preserved distant singular, a reminder, not a new model. And this same logic helps explain why the post-flood world is so saturated with caution. In these texts, caution is not cowardice. It is the price of continuity. The gods have already shown they can reset the whole system. No one forgets that. You can feel it in the literature that follows. Even where a text is not directly about the flood, it often carries the emotional weight of a civilization that remembers fragility. Kings boast, yes, but even royal inscriptions are full of anxiety about order maintenance, divine favor, proper ritual, and boundary keeping. Temples must be restored. Canals must be cleared. Omens must be read. Cities must remain aligned with the gods. Nothing is secure by default. That is one reason Mesopotamian civilization was so obsessed with writing things down. Lists, omens, laws, hymns, contracts, rituals, laments, proverbs, king lists, lexical exercises, administrative records. A culture that lives under the memory of disorder tries to preserve order in marks. It records what must be done, what was done, what went wrong before, what signs to watch, what words to say, what offerings to bring. Writing becomes one more way of holding the world together. And the flood stories sit inside that written world like a permanent warning label. You can build, you can govern, you can prosper. But do not confuse prosperity with permission to exceed the limits built into existence. That warning becomes even more striking when you compare Mesopotamian flood traditions to later better-known versions. In the biblical flood story, human violence and corruption become central. The moral framework is more explicit. In Mesopotamia, especially in Atrahasis, the emphasis falls elsewhere. The disturbance is collective, structural, environmental, acoustic. Humans are not necessarily condemned because they are cruel. They are condemned because they have become too numerous and too difficult for the divine order to accommodate. That difference is profound. It suggests a worldview where catastrophe does not wait for wickedness in the dramatic sense. Catastrophe can come because success itself has consequences. And that is a much more unsettling idea. It means you can be productive and still be doomed. You can be useful and still become unacceptable. You can fulfill your function and still trigger destruction because the function scales beyond what the system can tolerate. That, I think, is why these old tablets feel so alive, even now. They are not merely telling a story about gods and floods. They are wrestling with something civilizations keep discovering over and over again. The things that make a society strong can also make it unstable. Growth can become burden. Density can become danger. Noise can become stress. Systems built for success can produce crises simply by succeeding too well. The Mesopotamians express that truth through divine councils and sacred waters. We might express it differently. But the underlying tension is familiar enough to feel immediate. What do you do when your solution becomes your next problem? According to Atrahasis, the gods answered that question with plague, drought, famine, flood, and then permanent redesign. According to the wisdom tradition that followed, humans answered it with restraint, or at least with the hope that restraint might keep the old catastrophe from happening again. And yet one question keeps pressing through the clay. If the post-flood world was built on limitation, what did that mean for every ordinary sorrow that followed? It meant that suffering could no longer be treated as random. In the world imagined by these tablets, ordinary grief had structure. That is one of the hardest things to sit with in the final sections of Atrahasis. The text does not describe infertility, infant death disease, and shortened life as unfortunate side effects of a broken world. It presents them as features of the post-flood settlement. Arrangements, conditions, the terms under which humanity is allowed to continue. That gives the whole tradition a colder edge than many later religious stories. Because if those sorrows are built into the world by design, then they are not simply mysteries to endure. They are reminders of a bargain humanity never really got to negotiate. The gods decided that human beings could remain, but only in a reduced form. And what reduction means in practice is brutal. Not every womb will bear. Not every child will live. Not every life will run its natural course in peace. The wording in the epic is clinical enough to be disturbing. A third category of women who do not bear. A demon that snatches the infant from the lap. Women set apart in sacred roles removed from ordinary reproduction. Disease and death working constantly among the people. It reads less like poetry and more like a program. Whether we take that literally or symbolically, the emotional force is the same. The text is trying to explain why the human world is full of interruption, why families are broken by losses they did not choose, why life feels so fragile, why flourishing never seems to last without shadow. And the answer it gives is severe, because once humanity flourished too well, that idea changes the emotional temperature of Mesopotamian religion. It suggests that every ordinary sorrow might be linked, however distantly, to the memory of the flood and the noise that came before it. The world after the flood is not just a rebuilt world, it is a monitored world, a restrained world, a world in which growth is always checked by something. That may be one reason Mesopotamian culture developed such a strong relationship with ritual protection. Amulets, incantations, offerings, prayers, domestic rites, exorcisms, birth rituals, healing formulas. To modern eyes, these can look like scattered forms of superstition. But in the world of Atrahasis, they make grim sense. If disease, miscarriage, infant death, famine, and early mortality are all woven into reality as part of an ancient settlement, then every human household lives close to danger all the time. Protection is not optional. Protection is daily life. This is where figures like Lamashtu, or related child-snatching demons, become especially important. In later Mesopotamian tradition, such beings are often treated as nightmare presences, supernatural threats blamed for miscarriage, sickness, or infant mortality. But read against Atrahasis, these are not rogue monsters operating outside divine order. They are part of the order. They do a job. They enact a limit. That is what makes the theology so unsettling. The danger is not always chaos breaking into the system. Sometimes the danger is the system. And yet human beings did not respond to that with quiet acceptance alone. They resisted in the only ways they could. They prayed, they protected, they named, they performed rituals, they begged for mercy, they carved images, they recited incantations over beds, cradles, thresholds, and bodies. Even if suffering had a place in the cosmic arrangement, no parent simply surrendered a child without a fight. That tension between divine structure and human refusal gives Mesopotamian life much of its emotional depth. The texts may frame mortality and loss as built into the world, But the people living in that world still loved, feared, grieved, and resisted. Theology explained suffering. It did not make suffering feel fair. In fact, some traces of discomfort survive even inside the tradition itself. There are damaged fragments and broken passages where later readers suspect questions were once asked more openly. In some pieces of the flood tradition, the survivor seems to speak in a way that suggests unease, perhaps even protest. The text is too damaged to reconstruct fully, but enough remains to give the impression that not everyone accepted the settlement without emotional strain. There may once have been fuller lines asking why destruction had to be so complete, or why the people suffered for what was at root a success built into their nature. We cannot prove every missing question. Clay leaves too much to silence. But the silence itself can be eloquent. It tells us these stories were not simple comfort tales. They were attempts to live with an explanation that solved one problem while creating another. It explained why the world is harsh. It did not make the harshness easier to bear. That also helps us understand why the Mesopotamian afterflood imagination remains so focused on limits. If the old world was lost because humanity crossed some threshold of size, sound, and pressure, then the new world must be governed by caution. Not just moral caution, but demographic caution, social caution, existential caution. Live but not too expansively. Build but not without ritual order. Prosper, but never imagine prosperity has erased risk. That posture toward life shows up again and again in Mesopotamian thought. Their king lists are full of rise and fall. Their laments for destroyed cities read like voices who know civilization is never permanent. Their omen texts assume the future is unstable and must be watched. Their wisdom literature prefers moderation, caution, proper speech, correct conduct, and respect for the structure of things. All of it belongs to a civilization that remembers what it means to be corrected. And this memory may be why the flood itself never completely disappears from the background. Even when the specific story is not being retold, the logic of it remains active. Human life is finite for a reason. Populations do not expand endlessly for a reason. Loss shadows fertility for a reason. Disease visits the city for a reason. The gods once faced a human problem and solved it not by ending humanity, but by limiting what humanity could become. In that light, mortality itself becomes political, not political in the narrow modern sense, but in the deeper sense of governance. Mortality governs scale. It prevents accumulation. It keeps one generation from crowding out the next. It resets the living count again and again. Death is not just an end in these texts. It is a regulating force. That helps explain why immortality is treated so carefully in the myths. Oedipus cannot have it. Gilgamesh cannot keep it. Ordinary humanity is never invited into it. The flood survivor alone may stand outside normal death, but precisely because he stands outside normal human society, he is removed from the ordinary stream. His immortality is controlled by distance. The rest of humanity remains under the rhythm of birth and death, because that rhythm is part of what keeps the post-flood world from becoming the pre-flood world again. And the emotional consequence of that is enormous. It means every funeral, every child grave, every failed harvest, every fever, every famine belongs not only to individual grief, but to civilizational memory. The world is the way it is because the gods once found humanity intolerable at full volume. That is a hard sentence to inherit. But inherit it they did, and once inherited, it shaped everything. Family, anxiety, ritual, life, social caution, the language of wisdom, the value placed on obedience, the fear of excess, the deep reluctance to believe that any human success could be final or without cost. Still, even with all that caution, one uncomfortable fact remains. The post-flood settlement solved the gods' problem, but it did not solve humanity's question. How do you love a world that was redesigned to keep you from becoming too much? That may be the deepest emotional question hiding beneath all these old tablets. How do you live gratefully in a world whose limits were imposed because your kind once became inconvenient? The Mesopotamian answer seems to have been this: you do not pretend the world is gentle. You learn its terms. You honor the powers above you. You cultivate skill, piety, caution, and endurance. You accept that life is precious, precisely because it is brief, unstable, and always vulnerable to forces larger than yourself. That is not a comforting worldview, but it is a coherent one. And once you begin reading the wider body of Mesopotamian literature through that lens, the coherence becomes hard to miss. The flood story is not an isolated horror tucked away in one myth. It radiates outward. It explains why human beings are mortal, why city life is both glorious and dangerous, why kings must keep order, why rituals matter, why excess is feared, why the old wisdom texts sound so restrained. Even the great achievements of civilization, walls, canals, temples, laws, grain stores, archives, trade networks, seem shadowed by the awareness that complexity can turn against itself. Growth creates strain. Prosperity creates noise. Density creates pressure. Once those pressures rise high enough, something answers back. Sometimes a god, sometimes a river, sometimes famine, sometimes the internal collapse of the very system that once looked strong. That may be one reason the flood story traveled so well, both within Mesopotamia and far beyond it. It gives a dramatic shape to something every civilization eventually feels: the fear that success itself might be dangerous if it exceeds the world's ability to hold it. And Mesopotamia knew that fear intimately. This was a land of magnificent cities built in fragile landscapes. Everything depended on management. Rivers had to be redirected. Canals had to be dredged. Salinity could ruin fields. Drought could break stability. A failed harvest could become a political crisis. A flood could erase years of labor in days. Civilization, there was never a natural background. It was an achievement maintained against constant risk. So, when the tablets say humanity became too loud, the phrase may carry more than one meaning. Yes, it refers to literal clamor, the sound of too many people living too intensely. But it may also point to social and environmental pressure, the accumulated stress of civilization at scale. The old myth turns that stress into divine complaint, because that is how the culture framed cosmic limits. But behind the theology is a sharp intuition. There are thresholds beyond which flourishing becomes destabilizing. This becomes clearer when you compare Mesopotamian flood traditions with similar stories in other cultures. Egypt has its own tale of near extermination in the Book of the Heavenly Cow. There, the sun god Ra decides humanity must be destroyed after people turn against him. The goddess Hathor, in her fierce form, as Sekhmet descends and begins slaughtering humanity. The destruction continues until Ra changes his mind and devises a way to stop her by tricking her into drunkenness. Humanity survives, but only barely, and the gods withdraw into greater distance from the human world. The details are different, but the structure is familiar. Humanity becomes a problem. Divine destruction begins. The destruction is stopped before total extinction. The post-catastrophe world is marked by greater separation between gods and people. India preserves another flood story in which Manu is warned by a fish later understood as a form of Vishnu, that a great deluge is coming. He builds a boat, survives, and becomes the hinge between worlds. Again, the pattern appears, warning preservation of one line, destruction of the larger population, renewed humanity after catastrophe. These traditions are not identical, and we should be careful not to flatten them into one single story. But their echoes matter. Across cultures, flood and near extinction narratives often appear where civilizations are wrestling with the same underlying issues: fragility, scale, divine distance, human limits, the fear that the world can be reset. In Mesopotamia, though, the explanation remains especially striking because it is so unsentimental. Humanity did not need to become monstrously evil to trigger disaster. Humanity merely needed to become too much. That is a terrifying idea because it means catastrophe can emerge from ordinary success, not just from obvious wickedness. And yet, oddly enough, there is also a strange dignity in the Mesopotamian response to that terror. The literature does not collapse into despair. It becomes disciplined. It becomes attentive. It writes everything down. It teaches. It warns. It instructs the young. It preserves ritual. It builds again. In other words, even after the gods nearly erase them, humans continue doing what humans do. They survive by culture. That may be the real counterpart to the biological restraints described in Hypotheses. If the post-flood world limits human flourishing from above through mortality, infertility, and vulnerability, then human beings answer from below through memory, skill, and social form. They develop wisdom traditions. They make laws. They keep accounts. They perform rituals. They create urban order. They learn caution without giving up civilization itself. That balancing act is one of the great achievements of Mesopotamian culture. They did not conclude that cities were evil. They built cities. They did not conclude that growth was impossible. They cultivated growth. But they wrapped those ambitions in a worldview that never forgot cost. That is why so many of their proverbs feel like compressed versions of flood memory. Do not boast. Do not stir quarrels. Do not overreach. Do not trust stability too easily. Do not imagine yourself beyond consequence. These are not only moral instructions. They are civilizational habits. Behavioral breaks. A way of keeping daily life from swelling into the kind of excess the myths warn against. And perhaps that is why the flood remains so haunting. It is not only a story of destruction, it is a story about what comes after destruction and how the survivors choose to live. The answer is not endless mourning. It is managed continuation. A quieter humanity, a more fragile humanity, a humanity conscious, or at least told to be conscious, that its place in the world is conditional. That word matters, conditional. In these texts, existence is not guaranteed by love alone. It is tolerated under terms. That is one of the harshest and most memorable theological ideas the ancient world produced. But it also helps explain the emotional power of Mesopotamian religion. People prayed not because life was secure, but because it was not. They offered sacrifice not because the world was stable, but because stability had to be maintained. They feared the gods not merely because the gods were strong, but because the gods had already shown what happened when they lost patience. The flood proved that once. The post-flood world exists in the shadow of that proof. And so, the real question is not only why the flood happened. The deeper question is how that memory shaped what it meant to be human afterward. What kind of person do you become if your oldest stories teach that your ancestors were nearly erased for thriving too well? You become cautious. You become ritual-minded. You become aware that life is precious and temporary. You become suspicious of excess. You build, but you remember what water can do. You celebrate, but you do not forget silence. You raise children, but you know they are vulnerable. You prosper, but you do not assume prosperity is permission to ignore limits. In that sense, the flood does not only explain the past, it teaches a style of living in the present. And that style of living carries one final tension we have not fully faced yet. If humanity after the flood is meant to remain smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable, then what does Mesopotamian literature make of kings and empires of rulers who dream of greatness anyway? That tension sits at the center of Mesopotamian political imagination. On one hand, the myths teach restraint. They warn that humanity once crossed a threshold and was nearly destroyed for it. They explain suffering as the result of divine efforts to keep human life limited, mortal, and under control. On the other hand, Mesopotamian history is full of kings who did the exact opposite of shrinking quietly into the background. They built walls, conquered territory, moved labor forces, raised temples, counted tribute, and inscribed their achievements into clay and stone, as if they were trying to outshout time itself. So how do those two things exist together? How does a civilization shaped by flood memory also produce empires? The answer, I think, is that Mesopotamian greatness was always framed as legitimate only when it appeared ordered, sanctioned, and ritually aligned. Expansion itself was not automatically condemned. What was dangerous was uncontrolled expansion. Noise without supervision, growth without structure. Human activity that ceased to be framed as part of divine order and began to look like pressure spilling in every direction. A king ideally was not supposed to multiply chaos. He was supposed to manage it. That is why royal inscriptions so often sound less like celebrations of raw freedom and more like performances of proper administration. Kings boast, yes, but they boast about restoring temples, recutting canals, establishing justice, honoring gods, securing boundaries, defeating enemies who threatened order, and maintaining the conditions under which civilized life could continue. Even conquest is often presented as correction. The king is not merely enlarging himself, he is extending right arrangement. That distinction matters. In the mythic framework shaped by hypotheses and related traditions, the problem with pre-flood humanity was not simply size. It was unmanaged human scale, multiplication without sufficient divine framing, civilization becoming acoustically and socially excessive. By contrast, the king's task in historical Mesopotamia was to keep the human world legible to the gods, structured enough that prosperity would not dissolve into the kind of tumult that once provoked catastrophe. That may be why kingship itself is treated as divine gift in Sumerian tradition. The Sumerian king list famously says that kingship descended from heaven. That phrase is not just poetic ornament. It signals that political order is part of the solution to human instability. Kingship is one of the ways the gods keep the post-flood world from becoming the pre-flood world again. The list itself is fascinating because it preserves a memory of the flood as a dividing line in history. Before the flood come, the impossibly long reigns of antediluvian kings rulers associated with primordial cities and vast stretches of time. Then the flood comes. Then kingship descends again in a re-established human order. History is effectively split in two before catastrophe and after regulated restart. That is exactly the same logic we have seen elsewhere. The flood is not just one event among others. It is the hinge of the human condition. Everything after it belongs to a more controlled age. And yet even within that controlled age, rulers keep pushing toward greatness. They want cities that endure. They want names that outlast generations. They want monuments, annals, victories, walls, temples, and archives. Gilgamesh himself is the literary expression of that urge. He begins as the kind of king who refuses smallness. He presses outward. He demands more from the world than ordinary mortality seems willing to give. But notice where his story ends. not with immortality, not with escape, not with divine equality. It ends with walls, human walls, the walls of Uruk. That ending is not a failure of the story. It is the point. The king who wanted eternal life returns to a human city and learns to see human making as enough, or at least as all that can be truly possessed. He accepts that the proper form of greatness in the post-flood world is not endless transcendence. It is durable but mortal achievement. Build well, rule well, leave marks, but remain human. That is a very Mesopotamian compromise. It allows ambition, but only inside the frame of finitude. It allows cities, but not the fantasy that cities can make people godlike. It allows fame, but not the abolishing of death. It allows civilization, but only under the shadow of remembered correction. In that sense, kingship becomes a kind of cultural answer to the flood. If the flood revealed what happens when human proliferation becomes too unruly, then the king's job is to keep society from reaching that condition again. He regulates labor channels, water honors the gods, imposes law, and ideally suppresses the forms of social disorder that resemble pre-catastrophe tumult. Of course, actual kings often failed badly at this. History is full of rulers whose ambitions created the very strain they claimed to solve. Wars forced labor, dynastic collapse, famine, internal revolt, and imperial overreach are everywhere in Mesopotamian history. The same civilization that produced texts warning about excess also repeatedly tested the limits of scale. That contradiction is part of what makes the literature so alive. It is not naive. It knows that human beings learn caution and still keep reaching. And maybe that is why the flood remained necessary as memory. Because empires forget what proverbs remember. Monumental power tends to imagine itself exempt from the old rules. The flood story says otherwise. It says no human arrangement, however grand, stands outside the danger of becoming too much. This is where the clay tablets feel almost uncannily contemporary. Not because the details match modern life, but because the logic does. Civilizations still live with the temptation to believe that more is always better. More population, more production, more building, more expansion, more sound, more movement, more extraction, more reach. And civilizations still discover, sometimes slowly and sometimes all at once, that growth creates pressure. Pressure creates instability. Instability invites correction. The Mesopotamians personified that correction through gods' councils, floods, plagues, droughts, and decrees. We may use different language, but the underlying concern is familiar enough to remain uncomfortable. What happens when a system rewards growth beyond what its deeper structures can hold? Atrahasis gives one answer. Eventually something breaks, and once it breaks, the survivors inherit a new world with tighter limits. That inheritance shapes not just politics, but identity itself. To be human in the post-flood world is to belong to a species whose success has already once become a problem. That memory makes humility more than virtue. It makes humility survival logic. It also gives tragedy a different flavor. When kings fail, when cities fall, when empires collapse. Mesopotamian texts often frame those disasters in terms of divine abandonment, broken order, neglected ritual, or fate turning. But beneath those explanations, the flood remains the deepest precedent. Collapse has happened before, on the largest scale imaginable. No city is too important to disappear. No system is too strong to drown. That is one reason laments over destroyed cities are so powerful in this tradition. They are never just about one ruined place. They resonate with the larger fear that all human order stands under conditions it did not choose and does not fully control. A city can be beloved, ancient, beautiful, ritually central, and still fall. The gods can turn away, rivers can rise, armies can come, the storehouses can empty, the songs can stop. All that remains then is memory, and if memory is fortunate, writing, which brings us back once again to the tablet in the archive. Because the most astonishing thing may not be that Mesopotamians told such dark stories about themselves. It may be that they preserved them so carefully. They did not erase the idea that humanity's first mistake was flourishing too well. They copied it, taught it, stored it, reworked it into epics, wisdom texts, myths of immortality, royal ideology, and practical instruction. They let the clay remember what political ambition might otherwise forget. That suggests they believed memory itself was protective, not protection against death, not protection against flood in the literal sense, but protection against the oldest human temptation to imagine that success has freed us from limits. The flood story says it has not, and the king, if he is wise, rules as if he knows that. But wisdom and power are not the same thing. That is one of the final truths these texts keep circling. A king may understand the limits of mortality and still be unable to resist the seduction of scale. A civilization may preserve stories about catastrophe and still grow toward the very thresholds those stories were meant to warn against. Knowledge does not automatically become restraint. Sometimes it becomes ritual. Sometimes it becomes literature. Sometimes it becomes prophecy, ignored by the people most in need of hearing it. And that is why the Mesopotamian record is so compelling. It does not present human beings as creatures who learn once and remain corrected forever. It presents them as creatures who remember and repeat, build and lose fear the flood, and still chase greatness. The clay preserves both the warning and the recurrence. You can see this especially clearly in the proverb, traditions, and school texts. The small pieces of writing that may seem less dramatic than epics, but often reveal the everyday mind of a civilization. Scribes copied short sayings again and again, not because they were grand literature, but because they were useful. They shaped habits. They disciplined thought. They taught the young how to move through a world that was never as stable as it looked. Many of those sayings sound simple enough. Do not boast. The negligent person ruins his household. Do not speak improperly. A harsh mouth brings trouble. A sweet mouth gathers sweetness. Fate is a slippery bank. At first glance, this sounds like ordinary good advice. But read together with Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, Adapa, and the flood traditions. The proverbs begin to feel like the everyday version of a much older cosmic lesson. They train the individual to do on a small scale what civilization must do on a large scale: reduce unnecessary friction, reduce noise, reduce self-destructive excess. The point is not silence in an absolute sense. Mesopotamians were not trying to abolish life. They held festivals, sang hymns, bargained in markets, argued in courts, built temples, and celebrated kings. Their world was not mute, but it was a world deeply aware that too much of anything, too much speech, too much pride, too much conflict, too much growth could tip into danger. That is why the language of the old myths still matters. Humanity made noise. The gods responded. After that, civilization had to learn how to make just enough noise to remain alive without becoming intolerable. And that is a delicate art. Perhaps the most haunting thing about the whole Mesopotamian tradition is that it never fully solves the tension between flourishing and restraint. It simply lives inside it. Cities must grow enough to survive, but not so wildly that they strain the order holding them together. Families want children, but mortality and infertility stand close by. Kings seek greatness, but death claims them. Priests perform rituals to maintain divine favor, but divine favor is never fully guaranteed. Builders raise walls, but laments remind everyone that walls fall. The civilization does not overcome fragility. It becomes literate about fragility. That may be the most accurate way to put it. It writes fragility into myth, law, ritual, proverb, and epic. It does not deny the vulnerability of human life. It organizes around it. This is one reason the flood story continued to matter for so long. It was not merely a tale of what happened once. It became a pattern for understanding how the world works. Human systems rise. They make demands on the environment. They create crowding pressure, complexity, stress. Then some force, whether interpreted as divine judgment, ecological correction, political collapse, or bad fate, answers back. Survivors inherit less than what came before and must begin again under harsher clarity. That rhythm appears over and over in Mesopotamian history itself. Cities are founded, enlarged, fortified, celebrated, and then reduced by invasion, drought, salinity, internal fracture, or shifting power. Kingdoms rise with immense confidence and disappear into lists of dynasties. Whole capitals lose their centrality. Rivers change course. Trade routes move. Gods remain on the tablets long after the people who served them have vanished. If you grew up in a world like that, a world where even greatness had a short half-life, then a story about the gods nearly erasing humanity for growing too large would not sound absurd. It would sound like the largest version of something you already knew. Nothing expands forever. Nothing remains secure just because it is impressive. Nothing in the human world is beyond reversal. That is the knowledge the clay teaches, and it teaches it without much sentimentality. But there is one more dimension to all this that often gets overlooked. The Mesopotamian tradition does not only warn against excess, it also preserves a deep admiration for human skill. That is what prevents the worldview from becoming purely bleak. Human beings are fragile, yes. Limited, yes. Mortals under divine scrutiny, yes. But they are also clever, resilient, adaptive, and astonishingly capable. Enki's sympathy for humanity only makes sense if human beings are worth preserving. Gilgamesh's story only matters if human striving has genuine nobility in it. The flood survivor only becomes meaningful because something of civilization is worth carrying across catastrophe seedcraft, memory ritual continuity. Even the gods' dependence on sacrifice implies that human culture matters. It feeds divine life structures relation, sustains cosmic exchange. So, the Mesopotamian answer is not that humanity should disappear, it is that humanity must remain bounded. That distinction is crucial. These are not anti-human texts, they are anti-excess texts. They preserve suspicion towards scale without erasing the value of civilization itself. The city is still sacred. Writing is still precious. Ritual still matters. Wisdom still matters. Justice still matters. Kingship still matters. Human labor and creativity remain indispensable. The problem comes only when human success begins behaving as if no limit applies. That may be why the text still feels so contemporary. The emotional question they ask is not ancient in any narrow sense. It is perennial. How do you honor human creativity without letting it become destructive? How do you grow without crossing into self-defeating scale? How do you build systems that sustain life instead of overwhelming the world that supports them? Mesopotamia answered through myth because myth was its most powerful tool for holding social memory. We might answer through science policy, environmental ethics, urban planning, economics, or political theory. But the old intuition remains recognizable. The conditions that make prosperity possible are also the conditions that can be broken by prosperity itself. That is the dark brilliance of Atrahasis. It says the first human crisis was not disobedience, but uncontained success. And that idea changes everything. It means suffering is not always tied to vice. It means catastrophe is not always punishment in the straightforward moral sense. It means systems can fail because they work too well for too long. It means the world may contain limits so deep that ordinary flourishing, if multiplied enough, begins to sound like danger. And once you understand that the whole Mesopotamian archive starts to read like a long meditation on balance. How much city is too much city? How much speech is too much speech? How much growth is too much growth? How much ambition can human life carry before it begins calling floodwater toward itself? The tablets never answer in exact numbers. They answer in stories, in ruined cities, in dead heroes, in proverbs about quietness, in laments for what was lost, in gods who need service but cannot bear the sound of too many servants. In one boat on black water, carrying enough life to begin again, but not enough to repeat the old world unchanged. And maybe that is why the clay still feels cold in the imagination, because it is not only preserving a belief about gods, it is preserving a warning about scale. A warning from one of the first urban civilizations on Earth, written by people who knew the exhilaration of growth and the terror of collapse. Their conclusion was not that life is evil, it was that life must remember its measure, and measure in Mesopotamian thought was never merely numerical. It was moral, political, ritual, ecological, and existential all at once. To know your measure was to know your place. Not in the trivial sense of submission, but in the deeper sense of fitting yourself into a world whose order preceded you and could continue without you. That idea can sound harsh to modern ears because we are used to stories in which the human being is the unquestioned center of meaning. The Mesopotamian texts are far less flattering. They place humanity inside a network of dependence, under gods, under fate, under river systems, under mortality, under inherited limits. But there is something clarifying in that humility. The flood stories, the Adapa myth, the instructions, the proverbs, and the royal texts all converge on one point. Human life is real, important, creative, and worth preserving, but it is not sovereign. It cannot define reality on its own terms forever. Whenever it tries, whenever it begins to behave as if expansion, noise, and accumulation have no ceiling, something pushes back. That pushback may appear as Enlil losing sleep. It may appear as plague, drought, or famine. It may appear as the withdrawal of divine favor. It may appear as walls falling, dynasties collapsing, rivers shifting, harvests failing, or children dying before their parents. Different texts explain different sorrows in different ways. We should not force every piece of Mesopotamian literature into one single formula. But the pattern is strong enough to recognize excess is dangerous, limits are real, mortality is not a glitch. The post-flood world is a world of managed vulnerability. This is why the old stories still resist the temptation to become comforting allegories. They do not tell you the gods did everything for your moral improvement. They do not promise that justice will always look fair from a human perspective. They do not erase the violence of the flood or pretend the redesign of human life was gentle. The tablets preserve a cosmos in which power and necessity often outrun tenderness. And yet, remarkably, they also preserve gratitude for life itself. That may be the most human element in all of this. For all their severity, the wisdom traditions do not conclude that existence is worthless. They conclude that existence is precarious and therefore precious. Life is short, therefore handle it carefully. Speech matters, therefore use it with restraint. Family is fragile, therefore protect it. Cities can fall, therefore build them well. Favor can turn, therefore remember the gods. You cannot abolish mortality, therefore learn how to live within it. In that sense, Mesopotamian civilization does not simply bow to fear. It transforms fear into culture. That transformation is part of what the clay tablets themselves represent. Writing is one of the great acts of resistance against disappearance. Clay cracks, yes, but it can also endure. A spoken warning dies in air. A sign impressed into wet earth can wait 4,000 years in silence and still speak again. That is almost miraculous. The people who wrote Atrahasis and the related texts could not defeat mortality. They could not reverse the flood. They could not remove the conditions of the post-flood world. But they could remember. They could inscribe. They could preserve the lesson in forms durable enough to outlast cities, dynasties, languages, and even the gods' original temples. That is no small achievement. And it may be the most profound human answer the Mesopotamian archive gives to divine limitation. If humanity cannot become immortal biologically, it can still seek a kind of continuity through memory, through names, texts, walls, rituals, institutions, stories. Gilgamesh cannot keep the plant of life, but he can point to Uruk's walls. The flood survivor cannot restore the old world, but he can carry seed and craft into the next one. The scribe cannot stop death, but he can press signs into clay and make thought travel forward in time. So, perhaps the real human response to the gods' demand for smallness was not only obedience, it was endurance through form. That is why the archive matters so much. The archive is civilization, saying we know we are finite and we will still leave traces. We know the waters can rise and we will still build. We know the gods once found us too loud, and yet we will continue to speak carefully, skillfully, with enough discipline that our words might survive where our bodies cannot. This is where the emotional force of the tablet returns. When you imagine the scholar holding BM 78941 in the cold storage room, what they are really holding is not just a story about divine irritation. They are holding the memory of a civilization trying to explain why life is so difficult and why human greatness is always inseparable from human risk. They are holding an answer to grief, a harsh answer, yes. Not one we are required to accept, but still an answer. Why do we die? Because death was built into the settlement that followed the flood. Why are children vulnerable? Because post-flood humanity was deliberately limited. Why does prosperity fail? Because excess triggers correction. Why can't we simply flourish without consequence? Because flourishing itself once became the problem. Whether one believes those explanations literally is almost beside the point now. Historically, their importance lies in the way they structured a civilization's imagination. They taught people how to interpret instability. They turned suffering into something legible. They made the world's cruelties part of an inherited pattern rather than meaningless chaos. And that has real power. Even now, people reach for stories not only because stories entertain, but because stories make unbearable things sayable. The Mesopotamians did what humans always do when confronted with mortality, disaster, and loss. They built narratives large enough to hold them. In their case, those narratives were carved out of labor, floodwater divine councils, mortality, and noise. And perhaps noise is still the most unsettling part of all, because noise is ordinary. If the first mistake had been some glorious rebellion, the story would feel safer. We could file it away as mythic drama. But noise, growth, crowding, the sound of life accumulating, that is much harder to distance ourselves from. It means the crisis emerges not from extraordinary wickedness, but from ordinary human success. It means the danger is embedded in the ordinary momentum of civilization itself. That is why the old warning still stings. It says the thing that threatens you may not be the opposite of flourishing. It may be flourishing without measure, And that is not just a Mesopotamian idea. It is an ancient insight that keeps returning in new forms across history. Empires expand until they fracture. Economies overreach. Cities outgrow resources. Systems amplify their own stress. Populations strain what once sustained them. The names change. The frameworks change. But the fear is recognizable. Too much of a good thing can become a different kind of danger entirely. The tablets say the gods knew this, or perhaps more accurately, the people who wrote the tablets knew it, and gave that knowledge the form of divine memory. Either way, the conclusion remains. Humanity was not nearly erased because it failed to be human. Humanity was nearly erased because it succeeded too well. And the post-flood world, with all its mortality, all its grief, all its caution, all its wisdom, was the price of being allowed to continue after that success. By the end of the tradition, then, the question is no longer just what happened in the distant past. The question is what kind of species humanity becomes after learning that lesson. The Mesopotamian answer is complex. We become a remembering species, a species that knows it is dangerous to itself when it forgets proportion, a species that develops rituals, laws, kingship proverb, and writing, not simply to become impressive, but to remain livable. We become creatures of form, trying to keep force from spilling over. We become mourners, builders, calculators, priests, scribes, parents, rulers, and survivors, all living under the knowledge that our place in the cosmos is conditional. That is why so much of Mesopotamian literature feels both grand and restrained at once. It celebrates civilization, but it does not romanticize it. It values skill, but it does not worship limitlessness. It admires kings, but it never quite forgets that kings die. It preserves great cities, but it also preserves laments over their ruins. It writes the flood into history, and then builds a whole culture around the hope of never deserving such a correction again. And yet even that hope is never fully secure. Because for all the warnings, for all the proverbs, for all the rituals and sacred boundaries, human beings remain what they were from the beginning: productive, adaptive, social, restless, and inclined toward increase. The flood did not change our nature. It changed our conditions. It placed barriers around our flourishing. It made life shorter, birth riskier, survival less certain. But it did not make humans stop wanting more life, more continuity, more city, more memory, more children, more lasting names. That is why the post-flood world is full of tension rather than peace. The gods want quiet. Humans want continuation. The gods impose mortality. Humans pursue legacy. The gods keep the species finite. Humans invent archives, monuments, epics, dynasties, and rites of remembrance. The struggle never fully ends. It only changes form. This may be the most profound way to understand Mesopotamian civilization, not as a culture that solved the problem of limits, but as one that learned to live productively inside them. That is a different kind of greatness, less triumphant, more disciplined. It is the greatness of people who know the river can rise, the crop can fail, the king can die, the city can fall, and still decide to keep records, bake bricks, compose hymns, and teach children how to live carefully in a fragile world. The clay tablets themselves embody that choice. They are modest objects, often small enough to sit in a single palm. No glowing gold, no marble grandeur, just earth-shaped and fired. But that simplicity is fitting. Clay is the material from which humanity itself was said to be made. Clay is ordinary, local, fragile, when wet, durable, when fired. It holds impressions. It remembers pressure. In Mesopotamian thought, it is both matter and memory. The gods mix it with divine substance to create humans, and humans press it with signs to preserve thought. Creation and record-keeping mirror each other. That makes the surviving tablets more than historical evidence. Symbolically, they are almost the perfect medium for this story. Humanity made from clay tells its own story in clay, how it was made, how it multiplied, how it became too loud, how it was nearly erased, and how it was allowed to remain only under terms of mortality and reduction. The material itself becomes part of the message. And there is something deeply moving about that, not because the message is comforting, but because it is honest in a way many later traditions struggle to be. The Mesopotamian texts do not promise that existence is ultimately arranged for human happiness. They do not promise that all suffering is secretly benevolent. They do not pretend that power and justice always align in ways humans can easily accept. Instead, they preserve a world in which humans must make meaning under conditions they did not choose and cannot escape. That is a harsh inheritance, but it is also a recognizable one. Even now, many of the most difficult human questions remain the same. Why are we mortal? Why does flourishing carry risk? Why do systems collapse just when they seem strongest? Why do children die? Why does success so often produce strain instead of peace? Why does growth feel both necessary and dangerous? Why are our greatest powers tied so tightly to our greatest vulnerabilities? Mesopotamia answered those questions through divine politics and cosmic memory. It imagined that the oldest mistake was not wickedness, but overabundance. Not disobedience, but disturbance. Not rebellion, but noise. And then it built a civilization that kept trying to remember the cost of becoming too much. Whether that answer is true in any ultimate sense is not the only thing that matters. What matters historically and emotionally is that it helped people live. It gave them a framework for sorrow. It gave them reasons for caution. It gave them stories strong enough to bear the weight of mortality. It told them that their losses were not meaningless, even if the meaning was grim. It told them that the world after catastrophe could still contain order, even if that order came with permanent limits. There is a kind of wisdom in that, not the wisdom of easy reassurance, but the wisdom of proportion. The wisdom that says life is real, but not sovereign. Civilization is valuable, but not infinite. Success is good, but not self-justifying. Growth is natural, but not automatically safe. Mortality is painful, but not accidental. Suffering is bitter, but part of a world that has already once been reset. And from that wisdom comes one final moral posture, though the Mesopotamian texts would not have called it morality in our sense. It is the posture of listening to warnings, listening to elders, listening to old stories, listening to the river, listening to the gods, listening to the limits built into reality before ambition convinces us they are gone. That is why these ancient records still matter. Not because they offer a modern scientific theory of collapse or a universal theological truth that everyone must accept, but because they preserve one of humanity's earliest sustained meditations on the danger of unmeasured success. They remind us that civilizations have been worrying about scale, noise, fragility, and correction for a very long time. And they remind us that memory itself may be one of the few defenses against repeating what ruins us. The people who first pressed these signs into wet clay could not know how many empires would come after them. They could not know how many later religions would retell or transform their flood stories. They could not know that their broken tablets would eventually sit in museum basements, while scholars in another language and another age tried to reconstruct the shape of their fear. But they knew enough to preserve the warning. They knew enough to say this: "We were made for labor. We multiplied. We became loud," the gods answered. And everything after that has been shaped by the effort to keep living. without becoming once again too much. So we end where we began, with a tablet in the cold, a damaged piece of clay in museum storage, broken edge, missing corner, fine wedge marks still holding the shape of a thought pressed there almost 4,000 years ago. A record of divine complaint, human success, and the catastrophe that followed when success became unbearable. It would be easy to call this only myth and move on, but that word can sometimes make ancient texts feel smaller than they are. These Mesopotamian records are not small. They are among the earliest surviving attempts to explain why the human world is full of labor noise, fragility, mortality, and loss. They are among the earliest written reflections on the possibility that civilization itself carries danger within it. And they are among the earliest to suggest that the boundary we most fear is not always crossed by evil. Sometimes it is crossed by growth. That is what makes them endure. The Atrahasis epic, the Adapa myth, the flood traditions, the wisdom texts, the proverbs, the king lists, and the later echoes in Gilgamesh all point in the same general direction. Humanity was created as a solution. Humanity became a new problem. The gods tried partial correction and failed. Then came the flood. After that came redesign. Mortality, infertility, infant vulnerability, disease, and limited flourishing became part of the structure of post-flood life. Civilization resumed, but under smaller terms. You do not have to believe that literally to feel the force of it. As history, it tells us how one of the world's first great civilizations understood its own vulnerability. As literature, it offers a narrative far stranger and harsher than the later stories that would grow from similar soil. As philosophy, it poses a question that never stops being relevant. What if our greatest danger is not that we fail to flourish, but that we flourish without measure? That question is still difficult because it refuses easy moral comfort. It does not let us imagine that every disaster is a punishment for obvious wickedness. It does not flatter us by saying the world was built primarily around human preference. It asks something more unsettling. It asks whether systems, divine, natural, political, ecological, can be pushed beyond tolerance simply by the momentum of success. It asks whether growth creates consequences of its own. It asks whether civilization has always contained the risk of becoming louder than the world around it can bear. The Mesopotamians answered those fears with the language they had: gods, councils, clay, floodwater, and fate. They imagined Enlil unable to sleep because of human noise. They imagined Enki preserving humanity through clever compassion. They imagined a survivor crossing black water in a sealed boat while the old world disappeared. They imagined the gods realizing too late that they still needed the humans they had nearly destroyed. And they imagined a new arrangement, cruel but durable, in which humanity would continue only through limitation. That arrangement explains the world they knew. A world where cities rose and fell, where children died, where harvests failed, where kings were mighty but mortal, where disease lived close to the body, where every household understood that loss was never far away. In such a world, the idea that these things were not random, but part of the deepest structure of life would have carried terrible explanatory power. And still, for all its severity, the tradition does not end in silence. Humans keep building. That may be the most important thing to remember. After the flood, they build again. After mortality is confirmed, they still marry bear children and grieve those they lose. After learning that the gods want quiet, they still sing hymns, recite prayers, bargain in markets, and teach their sons and daughters in courtyards and homes. After discovering they cannot become immortal, they write. They write epics. They write proverbs. They write instructions. They write laments. They write records of grain and cattle and offerings and eclipses and lawsuits and omens. They write themselves forward into the future. That is the human answer the clay preserves. Not denial of limits, but persistence within them. Not immortality, but memory. Not innocence, but endurance. The flood did not erase humanity because one line survived. But more than that, the meaning of humanity did not disappear because stories survived. The old world was gone, but its warning could still travel. And in that sense, the tablets themselves are a quiet victory against annihilation. They do not undo death. They do not reverse divine judgment. But they refuse total disappearance. They keep the question alive. And the question remains powerful. If humanity's first mistake was thriving too successfully, then what does wisdom look like now? The Mesopotamian answer, at least in these texts, is not to reject civilization, but to remember proportion. Build, but remember the flood. Prosper, but remember mortality. Speak, but do not become all noise. Grow, but do not forget that every system has thresholds. Rule, but know that kings die. Love life, but do not imagine life is exempt from limit. That is not a modern manifesto. It is older, sadder, and perhaps more durable than a manifesto. It is civilizational caution burned into clay. And maybe that is why the story still lingers after the tablet is set back on its shelf. Because it does not really end with the gods. It ends with us. With the same species still building cities, still multiplying, still turning landscapes into systems, still mistaking momentum for safety, still asking whether the conditions that support human thriving can survive the scale of that thriving. The old Mesopotamian scribe could not have imagined the world now. But the emotional architecture of the warning would not be unfamiliar. Flourishing has costs. Noise has consequences. Growth is not automatically harmless. And memory matters because forgetting these things is one of the oldest ways civilizations prepare themselves for correction. So the clay remains, cold, quiet, enduring, a fragment of a much larger archive, a witness from one of humanity's first great urban worlds, a broken record of an unbroken fear that we were made to live, made to labor, made to build, made to multiply, and that somewhere in doing those things too well, we crossed a line our makers never wanted crossed. The tablet does not soften that fear, it simply preserves it. And perhaps that is enough, because sometimes the oldest stories do not survive to comfort us. Sometimes they survive to keep us honest,